Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 6th episode of our virtual seminar series this year. And this is the second in our new phase of the Pandemic Dialogues, the Reckoning and Recovery phase. I'm Paul Carice, Director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Our school launched this series to provide perspective on our current public health and civic crisis through conversations among our school's faculty and students and expert guests, as well as a wider community. Tonight's webinar is on science, health, and the common good. Part of our school's mission is to promote civic dialogue about pressing issues of our time, and each academic year, our speaker series, the Civic Discourse Project, extends the conversations and debates of our classrooms to a broader community. Arizona PBS records those speaker events and broadcasts them. You can visit our website to see all of our previous lectures in the Civic Discourse Project. That's at scetl.asu.edu. We're offering the Pandemic Dialogues in 2 modes. This series of live webinars that discuss a deeper perspective on pandemics or civic crisis, and also a podcast discussing Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. More information on these webinars and also on our school is available again on our website, scetl.asu.edu. And I am also told we are streaming tonight's webinar live on Facebook. To continue our discussions of reckoning and recovery, we're delighted tonight to welcome 2 experts on public health and the philosophy of science, Professor Farr Curlin of Duke University Medical School and Professor Ben Hurlbut of the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. We have a bit of a change tonight. We'll have just 2 parts to this evening's webinar. In part 1, I will jointly interview our 2 expert guests. And then in part 2, as normal, we will close the hour with a Q&A session, questions submitted by members of our virtual community joining us. So we ask you to please type your questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom. Our colleague in the school, Luke Perez, will be collecting these questions and sending them to me, and I will be posing them to our 2 guests. You can also use the hashtag Pandemic Dialogues on Twitter to participate in the discussion as well. So now to welcome our 2 guests. Farr A. Curlin, MD, is Josiah C. Trent Professor of Medical Humanities in the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and the History of Medicine, and co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke Divinity School. Before moving to Duke in 2014, Dr. Curlin founded and was co-director of the program on medicine and religion at the University of Chicago. At Duke University, Farr practices palliative medicine and works with colleagues in the Trent Center and the Divinity School to develop opportunities for education and scholarship at the intersection of theology, medicine, and culture. He's interested in the moral and spiritual dimensions of medical practice, particularly the doctor-patient relationship, the moral and professional formation of physicians, and practices of care for patients at the end of life. He also directs the Arte initiative in the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. And joining me is a colleague from Arizona State University, J. Benjamin Hurlbut, an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences. Ben trained in the history of modern biomedical and life sciences, and his research lies at the intersection of science and technology studies, bioethics, politics, and and political theory. He studies the changing relationships between science, politics, and law in the governance of biomedical research and innovation in the 20th and 21st centuries. Focusing on controversies around morally and technically complex problems in areas such as human embryonic stem cell research and genomics, Ben Hurlbut examines the interplay of science and technology with shifting notions of democracy, of religious and moral pluralism, and of public reason. He is author of the book, Experiments in Democracy, Human Embryo Research and the Politics of Bioethics, and he holds a bachelor's degree from Stanford University, a PhD in the history of science from Harvard University. He was also a postdoctoral fellow in the program on science, technology, and society at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So welcome to our 2 expert guests. I remind everyone joining us that you can submit questions for part 2 toward the end of our webinar hour via the Q&A feature in Zoom. So I let our guests know the initial questions I'd be starting off with. And we have a sequence for each question, and I believe Dr. Curlin will be answering this question first, then we'll hear from Ben Hurlbut. So to begin with, modern science and medical experts have played a commanding role in the response by the United States and many other countries to the current global coronavirus-19 pandemic, the COVID pandemic. There's been a secondary role for other disciplinary and policy perspectives. So in one view, this approach has diminished considerations of social life, public health, other common goods beyond medicine and epidemiology. So just confining our discussion to the American policy debate, do you think this degree of reliance on medical science and the predictive qualities of modern technology in the technological age reflect a justifiable confidence in modern science to address the ills of society, of human life, perhaps even to solve the problem of human mortality? Or do you think, given a reaction of fear about a novel virus and a pandemic, we've placed too much reliance on epidemiology or on medical expertise? Dr. Curlin.
Glad to be here. I think the question forces us to ask, if you will, the general question of why, when we're faced with some threat to something that we value, we should look to scientists or to physicians as having authority in determining our response. This is a question, you could say, of the authority of expertise. When should we consider people to have that authority properly? And it seems to me, with respect to scientists and medicine, that we reasonably grant that authority or recognize that authority when three conditions hold. First, the expert has knowledge about the threat and about courses of action we can take in response to the threat that is not available to the ordinary person. Second, that the expert can guide us through at least one course of action that is likely to successfully protect us from the threat. And again, that we would not already have obvious knowledge of that without their guidance. And third, and this is important, particularly in the COVID moment, that the side effects and the unintended consequences of following the course of action that they can guide us through, those side effects are minor in relation to the good that they can help us obtain, or in relation to what it is that they can help us protect. And I think in a place where where these conditions are clearly met, which I certainly observe in my work, is the condition of someone recently diagnosed with cancer. A few years ago, my own sister had pain in her belly, had a workup, and found that she had a large colon cancer tumor. Here's an example in which, and I immediately took steps to get her into the University of Chicago to see scientific experts and physicians, medical experts, to help her. It was clear that there are people at that university and at other universities who know things about cancer, and particularly her type of cancer, that are just not available to the average person. That they could guide her through a course of action that offered some reasonable probability of successfully defending her from the threat of that cancer, and particularly preserving her life. And that the side effects of the course of action that they're likely to recommend was pretty obviously not disproportionate to the good of preserving her life, even though those side effects can be rather burdensome. In that case, it makes sense for her to say to those scientists, tell me what to do. Those physicians, tell me what to do, to grant them the authority to guide her further responses. But when any of these three conditions do not hold, it seems to me we're not justified in deferring to scientists or physicians regarding how we should respond to a threat, even when that threat seems like a scientifically or a biological or other type of threat that scientists generally understand. If those conditions don't hold, it seems to me, or to the extent they don't hold, then those who claim authority of expertise really only have the pretense of that authority. So we see this, I see this in medicine, we see this in medicine frequently, when doctors don't, for example, have knowledge about the threat or don't have knowledge about the courses of action that we can take to respond to the threat, that is not already knowledge that's not already available to us. We see it with things like medically unexplained syndromes, which is a medical description of things that we just don't understand in medicine, but people bring those concerns to physicians often. We see it when, with respect to things like relational challenges, marriage and child rearing, where sometimes scientists put forward a pretense of having authority, and physicians are susceptible to this, that they really do not have. They don't have a basis for that claim of expertise. When physicians get together and oppose, let's say, a certain housing policy, which there may be good reason to oppose a housing policy, but when they do so, sometimes as physicians, they put forward a pretense of having some special access to knowledge that others don't have, that they in fact don't have. And we see this importantly when physicians presume to have or put forward the pretense of having knowledge about what we should do, when in fact the side effects of the course of action they can propose are substantial. And they're not clearly minor relative to the good that they propose to offer us or the benefits they propose to offer us. And I see that all the time as a hospice doctor when patients have advanced cancer or other advanced illnesses, where the scientists may understand them in a way that the public doesn't, but we don't have available anymore courses of action that actually offer sufficient probability of benefiting for there to be a scientific recommendation that we should consider to be authoritative. So what about COVID? It seems to me, and then I'll stop here for the moment. It seems to me with respect to COVID, if we look at clinical management, I think doctors and scientists do have authority of expertise that's well founded. If you get sick, if any listener to this webinar gets sick with COVID and is seriously ill, they have good reason to go to find well-trained physicians who can take care of you because they're going to understand your illness, be able to offer you a way forward that protects your health, and the side effects of doing so are clearly not going to be disproportionate to what they can offer. But when we move to the area of public health policy, how should we as a society react to the threat of COVID? It's not at all clear that scientists and physicians have a kind of access to expertise or offer a courses of action that are clearly going to benefit, or much less that what they might propose clearly has side effects that are minor relative to the intended aims. So all of those conditions get quite wobbly when we start moving into public health policy, it seems to me.
Thank you so much. Ben Hurlbut, now your response to this question: have we placed the appropriate amount of confidence in medical scientists and epidemiologists in this crisis, which is a very substantial amount of confidence, or have we gone too far with that, given the complexity of this situation?
So I appreciate very much what Farr just said, and I think I agree with essentially all of it. But I think the comment I'd like to make sort of builds on what he says. So those three conditions, I agree, are absolutely essential. And yet at the same time, there's this sort of strange problem of who knows whether those who know correctly, right? So who's going to know the knowers, so to speak? Put that differently, how does a community, a society, or an individual go about evaluating whether the claim to expertise is being exercised in a way that meets those criteria, is being exercised legitimately? And I think that is the kind of that's the core challenge here. So there are maybe no other normal social relationships beyond maybe very intimate relationships in which one places greater trust, where there's a greater asymmetry in authority and one places greater trust than a patient does in a physician. And yet the norms of that relationship are contingent. They have changed over time. There was a moment, a few decades ago when your sister would not have been told of her cancer diagnosis because it was important to protect her from that corrosive knowledge so that she could live out her remaining days. And these relationships alter in time. And so too have public health relationships. in not the same ways, but in somewhat parallel ways, where there have been moments in which there's greater trust placed in a centralized authority that ostensibly knows best to say what should be done. And I think that the question here about sort of too much or too little reliance on epidemiological expertise is, on the one hand, a question about the nature of that expertise. What is known and what isn't known? How well is it known? How is that knowledge represented? But at the same time, it's a issue of the reliance upon particular forms of knowledge, a pre-existing, you might say, social relationship in which there's an expectation that knowledge is the problem and that the experts have the answer. Where does that come from? Well, to some degree, it's experts asking us to understand problems in their particular terms and trust their answers as the appropriate answers. But it goes the other way as well. The desire to have crisp and clear answers, certain forms of certitude supplied in circumstances of profound uncertainty. And the circumstances we've found ourselves in the last several months are profoundly uncertain. And I think it's absolutely right that knowledge has been evolving quickly. It's profoundly incomplete. It remains very incomplete. The sorts of questions that we would like to have answered, which presumably would translate straightforwardly into policies, into practices that would make life at least have some predictability and regularity, if not normality. There's a real appetite for that. And there's also a desire to fulfill that appetite, to sate that appetite on the part of experts who are enjoying, you might say, a moment of celebrity that's really quite unprecedented. I mean, Tony Fauci asked for Brad Pitt to play him on Saturday Night Live, and he did. But I think, one of the things that was striking to me in February and into March, middle of March especially, was the fixation on the numbers and the role that epidemiological modeling played in constituting a conversation, also in shaping judgments from individual all the way up to high-level policy. But I think actually even more fundamentally, in defining the terms of conversation in which we ask ourselves, what should we do now? What do we need to do? Which became a kind of question of what do we need to know? Who knows? And these little moments of political crisis, like where the British epidemiologist Niall Ferguson, whose model played an absolutely profound role in reshaping the face of, well, life in this country for sure, but elsewhere in the world as well, sort of stepped outside of the rules of practice in the UK because, well, he knew best. He was post-COVID and therefore presumably immune and therefore could travel or see other people in ways that, people shouldn't be seeing each other if they don't know what they need to know in order to make those special sorts of expert judgments, which end up being, in this case, a kind of exceptional judgment. I mean, why was that such a crisis? Because actually, if you step back and you say, well, if we're just worried about infection, actually, that's pretty reasonable. It was a violation of the relationship that stands back of the placing of the deference to the authority of an expert who declares what should be done on behalf of a society, and a society that is receptive to and prepared to draw upon that expertise and place itself in his safe hands, so to speak. So I think back of this is a question, and these are sort of perpetual questions. In my view, these are political questions. They are fundamental democratic questions about the right relationship between expert and public, where that's not given in advance by some source of transcendent knowledge that anoints the expert as expert, but rather in a kind of prior collective judgment about what needs to be known. What is the relationship between judgments about the right way to know something and the right way to act vis-a-vis that, where questions of what at stake, which are normative questions, become ingredients in setting the parameters of what counts as expertise for purposes of public deliberation and judgment. And that is, I think, something that we have failed to confront, or insofar as we are confronting it, it's it's unfortunately taking place in a pretty ugly way, where there's a questioning of the presumptive expertise of the expert, whether the expert really is expert, whether the authority really is well-grounded, rather than asking that the political question about, to what extent ought we rely upon epidemiological inputs, and to what extent do the questions we need to ask exceed the bounds of that picture of the world and the sorts of answers that experts in it can give.
Well, thank you. Let me improvise a little bit on the second question that I had shared with both of you to follow up on your initial responses, both Farr and Ben. I'll tie the two of them together to say that there is a caution each of you is giving about the complexity of a public health crisis like this, and the need to make careful distinctions about what we do know and don't know about expertise. So the phrase that I had used is intellectual humility about what claims we make and the strength of claims and the policy advice that we give. So without being unfair to epidemiologists, other experts who have been in the public spotlight for months now, could each of you share, as Ben just did, an example of an error of approach, but let me improvise a little bit and say a model that you think of scientific epidemiological expertise appropriately balanced with other views about what public health is or the common good. And I think we agreed that Ben would start off and then Farr would chime in on this one.
So I'm not sure if I have a specific failure. I also don't want to play the role of second guessing. One of the tricky things about a conversation like this is that it's too easy to lapse into the terms of debate as they've been set and say, well, this interpretation of this data was, disproportionate in this way, and we shouldn't have done this on the basis of that. Well, actually, to me, the more fundamental questions are, how do those come to be the terms of debate, and were those the right terms of debate? And I think that one of the problems, I don't know whether one can't, I think, really attribute this to the epidemiologists, although to some degree, some epidemiologists certainly capitalized upon it. But I think what one can't attribute to them wholly is the desire to have answers that are provided in their terms. And one of the things that was striking to me in the moment in which we were shifting from a sort of presumption that something like this couldn't happen to us to the recognition that it is happening to us and we need to suddenly react, and in extremity kind of, was the way in which models, predictions of the future, that were not predictions of a holistic future, but predictions of a future in which that was built around body counts, basically, built around lives lost, how those were offered as rhetorical tools for convincing a public to recognize a problem and convincing its leaders to recognize a problem, with small footnotes as caveats. Well, a model is only as good as the inputs that the model has, and et cetera, but look at this exponential growth curve. That should terrify you. There is a moral story embedded into that growth curve. And the question is not whether it's correct or not. The question is how the story is being told and for what kind of rhetorical or political effect. Because I think that there was clearly a sense that there was a responsibility of those who knew best, epidemiologically speaking, to convey the significance of what it was that they knew best, namely what an epidemic was going to look like a little ways down the line. Present pain is just a tiny taste of future disaster. And to make the judgment about how we should make a judgment about how to respond by, in effect, terrifying us with the growth curves, if you see what I mean. I think that we would have done better had we stepped back from that and said, had there been a warning label that said, look, this is provisional. This is based on significant unknowns. There are enormous uncertainties here. What you should see here is not that this might not happen, but rather that this is a possibility, and that given this circumstance of uncertainty that we as a society find ourselves in, we as humanity in effect find ourselves in, we have to ask the question, what's the right way to make judgments about what costs are too costly, what steps are appropriate in the name of protecting the lives in our care, in effect. And that is a question that can't be answered in epidemiological terms, even if epidemiological knowledge is an essential input into it. And I think that so in sum, I think that the models did far too much talking for us, whereas we really needed to do some collective talking, because a little ways into this crisis, where the response was a kind of acute emergency response, as the fatigue set in, as the recognition of just how profoundly lives were disrupted confronted us, it was sort of like we didn't know how to talk about that, because we had already committed ourselves to that transformed form of life on the basis of reasons that are not amenable, actually, to questioning whether those transformations are right and appropriate and necessary.
Thank you. Farr, Curlin, your thoughts about lessons we might learn thinking ahead in continuance of this pandemic and the public policy need, or future public health crises or pandemics, judgments, examples that went well or went badly with medical.
Well, picking up on the themes Ben brought up, one pattern of badly invoking science, which I won't pin on any specific person, but it's afflicted a number of people, is that the kind of rhetoric of, we're going to let the science decide when we open. We're going to let the scientists tell us what the right thing is to do. We have a need in a case of a threat or perceived threat to publicly organize a response, and those who are in positions in which they're expected to, positions of authority, expected to make choices about policies, need to make those choices and need to justify them. And in our world, it seems like rather than having that difficult conversation that Ben mentioned, that's going to bring up all kinds of fractious disagreements, and that's going to expose the fact that that we have to tell some kind of story about what kind of a people we intend to be, what kind of what we think we owe to one another, what it really means to flourish, which we are not practiced in talking about those things, much less do we have shared standards about them. It's easy to kind of default to, well, we'll let the science decide. But I think we've seen that be invoked in ways that clearly don't actually, invoked in ways that show that we don't have science that gives us actual knowledge of what we ought to do, but rather that we appeal to some kind of set of scientific data or particular scientists' opinions to justify our sense of what would be a fitting, on the whole, response, but without bringing all the details about why we think that's a fitting, on the whole, response. So on one side, someone invokes the scientists who say, scientists say lives will be lost when Texas opens up. There will be bodies, there will be deaths that are on the doorstep of those setting that policies. Someone else invokes the scientists to say, X scientist shows mortality rate much lower than expected. Curve is flattened. We're going by the science. When in fact, the disagreement is not so much about the data. The disagreement is about which is more important, or how big of a deal it is to live with some risk, how important it is to get out and go to work, or go to church, or go to the park, how much pain people can take in those areas, how much the government should control people's lives. All those kinds of questions are at stake, and they're hard questions to deal with. And science becomes, and I've seen this over the years innumerable times with respect to areas of controversy, certainly the area of stem cell research, which Ben's written about, is an example, where rather than debate the real substance, people invoke science as either on their side or against their opponents, in a way that is suggesting the science has a kind of authority to tell us what to do that it just doesn't have.
That leads perfectly, Farr, to the next question I had discussed with you. What is it, for both of you, what is it about modern Western medical science, biotechnology, grounded in modern technology, modern natural science generally, that what is it that has gained such power in our thinking about a crisis, but more generally in our economy and universities, our public policy debates? Why has this claim of expertise compared to other claims of expertise gained such authority? And I think we said we would start with Farr and then have Ben's response.
I was helped in learning to think about this kind of question by reading a book written by Jerry McKinney, who's a scholar at Notre Dame University. Wrote a book, actually it was his dissertation further developed, called To Relieve the Human Condition. And in that, McKinney goes back to Francis Bacon, arguably the father of modern science, or at least the modern scientific method, and notes that Bacon saw modern science as the means by which we would be able to take this material world that we have inherited, that we find ourselves living in, and make it useful toward helping our neighbors. So science essentially becomes the way that we're going to make Christian charity. Bacon was an Anglican. We're going to make Christian charity effective. And in many respects, modern science has done that. It has made charity effective. To invoke the story of the Good Samaritan, because of modern science, the Good Samaritan cannot just pour oil on and bind up the wounds of the man found beside the road, but can get him to a world-class hospital where his injuries can be effectively treated, even extraordinarily severe injuries, so that he can have great confidence of returning fully to health. That's a remarkable achievement. And achievements like this have propelled the modern sciences into positions of cultural power and authority. And in many cases, I would say, well-deserved authority, based on the authority of expertise, at least. Unfortunately, McKinney goes on to say, built into Bacon's vision was this idea that nature, including human nature, has no given purpose. We have no end, or what Aristotle called a final cause, what a thing is for, what the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre says is what it would be if that thing realized its essential nature. Bacon saw that as something that is not discoverable in nature itself. It's not there, but must be brought in externally. And so, in Bacon's view, for humans to wrest from nature the powers for good that nature offers us, that are there latent, we needed to free science from these old superstitions, particularly religious superstitions that might hold us back. And we're left, to jump forward a few centuries, we're left in today's world with the view of science and scientists that results after several generations of acting as if all that's real in our world can be explained in terms of what Aristotle called material causes and efficient causes. The stuff that things are made of and what makes a thing move from A to B, what causes it to something to happen. And when people start raising concerns about purpose and meaning and human nature and human good and a good society, the kinds of things that has been noted we just not practiced in talking about, much less if they start invoking concepts like sin and righteousness and judgment, then what people are doing in this modern sensibility is they're trying to impose their personal values and ideologies, which seem increasingly arbitrary and idiosyncratic, onto debates that are properly determined by a universal science, a basis that we all have access to. And if you think about it, material and efficient causes, what stuff is and what's made of, I'm sorry, not what it is, but what it's made of and how to make stuff and how to do things with it, those are precisely the things that modern scientific ways of knowing are good at. So science gets elevated, as some have put it, to a new kind of priesthood in our world, which is able to tell us what kind of salvation is possible to us and what we must do to obtain that salvation.
Ben, you did mention earlier the observation that we were fixated on numbers, or there was such an importance on numbers, and that became kind of data and numbers became a focus of debate. I suppose that fits with Farr's idea that a certain material, empirical, quantifiable focus and power is one reason we give such privileged position to medical science and natural science and technology. But maybe you have another idea in mind.
Yeah, well, I guess I would come at this from two directions. One is to parochialize the phenomenon by observing that the way we in the US responded to and engaged with the numbers was pretty different, actually, than the way the UK and Germany and arguably France and et cetera. I mean, the way different countries and different political communities contended with the same knowledge. In other words, the same knowledge is not the same knowledge in different political contexts. And it would take too much to sort of go into the details, which I don't have a full grasp of myself, of the sort of political variation, the cross-national political variation in the ways in which the same technical objects or epistemic claims or whatever played out. If for those who are interested in this, I'd refer you to the work of my colleague and collaborator, Sheila Jasanoff, who has written about what she calls civic epistemologies, different modes, different political modes of relying upon and engaging expertise. Her work is focused primarily on Germany, the UK, and the US in a comparative mode. And they're, I mean, these are sort of scientific and technological societies that, standing from a distance, look pretty similar in those regards. And yet the same science and technology has different meanings and is taken up and deployed in public space in different ways in those different contexts. So there's one thing that I would say is that we should be attentive to these things because they point not merely to the nature of science and technology and political modernity, but also to political modernity or the varieties of political modernity of which science and technology are part. So they are not extrinsic, they are intrinsic. The other thing that I would say, and I think this is more in line with what Farr is saying, is that in American public life, it has come to be the case that technical expertise, technical expert input often functions as the sort of what you might call a common vernacular, sort of what, for those who care, what Habermas might call an ideal speech situation, the shared vocabulary upon which then debate takes place. But what I would observe is that oftentimes that debate ends up taking the form of contesting the scientific or technical claims that are in circulation as the ostensibly unproblematic, straightforward prerequisites for having a public debate. So one of the things I've been thinking about in the last couple of days is this controversy around hydroxychloroquine, this anti-malarial drug that, it's a very bizarre phenomenon. And yet, here's an instance in which some preliminary sort of intuitions and ideas and laboratory demonstrations and very sort of modest preliminary but rapidly undertaken studies, made suggestions about whether or not this is an effective therapeutic response to SARS-CoV-2, to COVID-19. And yet, whether it's because of a sense of the need to produce knowledge rapidly and put it into circulation, or a sense of the pull of the forms of celebrity that come from that, probably a mixture of the two, these conversations, which would normally be quite sort of technical, even mundane conversations in scientific space play out in the public sphere, and immediately, in a sense, fall into polarizations that ought not be polarized by virtue of the fact that they're supposed to be standing upon secure, objective, extra-political knowledge, right? And then the question becomes, well, is that knowledge politicized or is it pure? And what that points to, I think, is a sort of elevation of ways of knowing, of science, of sort of scientific knowledge, technique, and technology, as to what I've elsewhere called as a constitutional position, as a sort of constitutional fundamental, as the thing that bridges between irreconcilable pluralisms and discipline them into the parameters of sort of shared public reasoning. You don't buy into this, you don't get to be part of the conversation. And that sense, whatever its genealogy, has I actually think a quite corrosive effect on our capacity to engage in the sorts of conversations that I think Farr and I have been making reference to. Farr, you've said that we're unpracticed. I think that it's a kind of cultivated incapacity that is a function of seeking to place too much in too few hands, demanding, in a sense, that authoritative expertise tell us what's right, so that we can, in a sort of epistemic sense, what's right knowledge, such that we can then have a well-reasoned conversation about what's right in a sort of political and moral and a normative sense. And yet, as with the models, if you don't ask the question of the answer, why was this the right question and what other questions didn't you ask? What's left out of your ostensibly complete picture of the world? Well, the political conversation that you build upon that foundational picture of things is necessarily and intrinsically incomplete because it was attenuated from the start. But married to that is this sense that, this is in a kind of in a secular environment that imports, as Bacon did, aspirations to a kind of a salvation from a way of thinking that was rather different. There is a sense in which this is not just a kind of convenient foundation for shared discourse or a imposed foundation for shared discourse or whatever, but also is a sort of locus of a kind of shared imagination of progress. This is the pathway to progress. This is what is essential, and that a kind of problematization of that, of any sort, comes to be controversial by virtue of being a kind of denial of an article of faith, you might say.
Let me at that point shift to our second part, because we do have some very interesting questions that come in from our virtual audience. And let me start with a point you just finished with, Ben. This to both Farr and to Ben. We have two different questions that came in. Marianne Kushner asked a question about the devaluing of experts and expertise in a period of a very populist politics in the United States. And she's particularly talking about the current president, who thinks he knows more than people who would be perhaps scientific experts or other public policy experts. And then we had another question from John, is his name, about the medical studies, Ben, you were referring to, that had to be withdrawn about hydroxychloroquine because they were rushed. So we have a really conflicting picture here and quite conflicting views about what expertise is and whether it's being presented appropriately in addressing a public crisis, and then just in general what the status of claims of expertise should be. So let me start with Farr and then Ben in response to that.
Thank you. I think the world of science and scientists and medicine and medical experts is has sowed in the wind and reaping the whirlwind in the sense that we have for too long overstated the kind of expertise we had. That happens in medicine, in the medicalization of human experience, and in trying to apply the concepts and the terms and the forms of knowing available to us in scientific modes to control a certain aspect of human experience, that it just doesn't fit. And when we start putting forward claims in the name of science that even a relatively uneducated layperson has a rightly founded intuitive sense, hey, I don't think that's actually something that science can tell us, then we undermine the claims of expertise that we need to be able to rely on when that expertise is well founded. So it's a really difficult political problem. I'll give you an example. 15 years ago, when there was a debate that was quite hot at that point about whether the FDA should make emergency contraceptives available without a prescription, which they have been now for more than a decade. But at that time, that was in the air. This was in the presidency of George W. Bush, and the FDA decided at one point it was not going to do so. And there were just a raft of articles published, including some really leading medical scientists who made the claim, this is an example of ideology trumping science. And science is being distorted, and things are not being based on science. And in fact, when you look at the debates there within the FDA, there was not a disagreement about the science. It's just that the science was limited, and there were implications and side effects and of the question that science can't answer. And some people had strong opinions about one set of those, and some had another. And the science just couldn't settle the disagreement. So, but when you start claiming that science says you're supposed to do this thing that science cannot say, you erode the public trust and you make people basically reflexively defensive. I would personally extraordinarily reflexively defensive when people claim things in the name of science, because unless they're able to say, I have an argument based on this data, and these are the conclusions, and these are the limitations, and here I recognize some potential weaknesses, then I don't think the invocation of science or scientific expertise tells us much.
Ben, can I interject a question related to this from one of our regular viewers and attending our lectures, Roy Miller, about the idea of data? How can we get to a political culture and an intellectual culture where the invocation of data or of science would not be so regularly used as a kind of trump card, to use a phrase? That is it education of medical scientists, of other natural scientific experts, to say, don't claim so much, be candid about the complexity and about what you do know and what you don't know and the multiple factors involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's actually instructive to go back to the cancer patient example, because, a patient could in an encounter with an oncologist, that oncologist could recite chapter and verse an immense wealth of knowledge about that patient's condition. And at the end of it, the answer, what is the appropriate therapy? What should we do? Has not even remotely been answered. And in fact, it may have been counterproductive in that sense. And so, but at the same time, it is a necessary and appropriate step for that physician to make the recommendation about what's the appropriate therapy, what should be done, right? And yet in making that step, it brings into consideration all sorts of other dimensions that are in a sense beyond the specific technical knowledge appropriate to that domain of oncology, about what phase of life this person is in, how this person stands in relation to the potential for their own death, et cetera. What level of competency do they bring to a process of rendering judgment? What way of understanding what's at stake is going to make sense? And those are, in a sense, dialogic problems. I mean, those are matters surely that have to be sorted out in the context of a back and forth dialogue, and not in a sort of unidirectional and cookie cutter sense. And there is a sense in which, the notion that the data will save us. Well, the notion that in the data lies the answer and that the answer will save us, that is the problematic two-step move. So it's, you know, as Farr was saying, it's not just that science knows or that science knows best. It's the promise that science will save us, because we only care in a context like this about what science knows insofar as we hope that that will be the source of our salvation, right? And I think that, you know, there's a deficit in humility in the ways in which the expansive but patchy and partial picture of things that the expert has is drawn into public space, in which the real question is, what should we do? What will save us here? I think that hydroxychloroquine case is actually very interesting. The paper that was recently retracted from the Lancet is really quite interesting in this regard, because there was another paper published in the Lancet by some Brazilian researchers right around the same time, showing that, you know, there were similar sorts of risks associated with the use of chloroquine, toxicity risks, and they received death threats for that, and were threatened with prosecution by Brazilian authorities for coming down on the sort of wrong side with the wrong answer to that question. And then, you know, so here's a moment of anti-science, right? And then, you know, in a sense, from a public perspective, you might see these, you know, the Harvard public health researcher and the Brazilian researchers as sort of interchangeable. They're all science. And a similar study based on a very large body of data that turns out to have been, you know, inaccessible for scrutiny and therefore untrustworthy, is retracted. And the implication there for, I mean, you know, I think it's worth appreciating how this is seen from the outside. This is not a sort of, you know, slip up in peer review, or science is messy and it's a process and it's provisional and et cetera, et cetera. It's, you know, where science has promised to save us, those who have heard that it has the cure encounter a different scientific tune that says, in fact, no, that cure will kill you. And then when that different tune turns out to have been empty, this is, in a sense, you know, threatening the people who were otherwise placing their hopes in this remedy for restoring their lives and livelihoods, with something like death, right? And so I think that how one fixes these pathologies, you know, in a sense, they are dialectical. They reinforce one another and entrench one another, and therefore they are very difficult to dig ourselves out of. But, you know, there's a sense in which the science is a human enterprise. Science, which is a human enterprise, too often presents itself as a superhuman enterprise, as above the fray, as a transcendent institution, capable of handing down knowledge that is above and outside of the complexities of collective social life, and that is a misrepresentation. It's a political misrepresentation, not merely an epistemological misrepresentation, one that has profoundly corrosive effects indeed for the very position of scientific authority as a necessary reservoir of expertise in scientific and technological societies in which people get cancer and need to and should go to the oncologist, in which epidemics happen, and public health authorities are absolutely necessary for the capacity of societies to make it through those crises.
So I think we have time for two more questions from our audience, and one of them flows from the answers each of you just gave, Farr and Ben, to that earlier question, and it's from Catherine Clark, one of our students, and she has a two-part question. I'm going to focus on just one of the parts, which is what other considerations, what other units of measurement beyond deaths or possible deaths should we include in decision-making processes about public health, broadly defined, about the common good broadly defined. And I'll add my own editorial point so as to move us away from an inappropriately narrow focus on data has the answer, science has the answer, something like that.
Right.
So why don't we, Farr, why don't we start with you?
Well, part of the challenge is we can't convert all of the things that we're going to consider into a denominator that utilitarians wish we could. Some act often as if we could, but we can't. So we need to take them into account in some way that doesn't presume that we can put them into numbers that will generate out of an algorithm a right answer. That if we put in the right inputs, we'll get the right answer. But clearly, we have to consider to the best of our ability are going to be the kinds of consequences of whatever choice we make. And I think what's striking in this moment is that the counting of deaths, I mean, deaths are simple to count. That's one reason to count them. It's really easy to know when you have one. And they're also dramatic. So they help focus people's attention, simplify our attention. And that can be useful in the right context. But they can also terribly oversimplify. So for example, just think of the different rhetoric between the notion that 100,000 people might die and the proportion of people that die this year might, or the number of people that die this year on the whole is going to go up by a small amount, a few percentage. And much of that is going to be people dying from this novel virus. Just even that changes the way you think about things, because it brings into view, that actually death is going to happen to a lot of people this year, even if the scientists give us great answers to the questions we put to them. Millions of people are going to die this year. And that doesn't make the 100,000 less important, but it does force us to reckon with the fact that we can't control fully our mortality. A backstory to this, and I'll try to wrap this up, is that it turns out our capacity to control the hour of our death, to keep ourselves alive through the use of scientific reasoning and through the use of scientific technologies, is still pretty modest. Once we get past clean water, and it's still pretty modest. And I think that's something we don't like to grapple with. That the reality is that we're going to die at some point. We don't have that much control over it. I think we have to bring that into our consideration. And then we have to bring into consideration what is it makes a life flourish. And that means, of course, relationships. It means work. It means play. It means worship. It means a number of things that can be affected by any policy we have. Does that mean we shouldn't have a policy of locking down? No, it doesn't mean it in any straightforward way at all. But it does mean that we're not going to, by counting bodies and repeatedly saying things like, people are going to die if you do that. It does mean that kind of reasoning is woefully insufficient.
Ben?
So I think this is a great question to end on. I think it's an absolutely crucial question. And I think there's sort of two dimensions to it. One is the uncounted and difficult to count dimensions. So for example, I've been thinking and worrying quite a lot about my students. At ASU, we have many of these sorts of students whose lives, who are first in their families to go to college, who are in highly precarious situations, socially, financially, et cetera, are sort of navigating on a sort of fragile knife's edge. And where there's a very strong potential that this will, not because they got sick, but because of knock-on effects, will be knocked off of that knife's edge, and their lives will follow a very different trajectory. That, in a sense, is a future life lost, but one that will not be counted in any epidemiological model, at least not in any sort of sufficiently complete way, because it's a sort of opportunity lost. It's a future lost. The other day, I took my daughter into the grocery store, and we came out of the grocery store, and she said, "Dad, that was great. I have not been to the grocery store since March, and it feels so good to do that." And sort of seeing how difficult it's been for my kids and well, everybody's kids to be pulled out of their social environments, separated from their friends, and ask them to put their lives on hold, even as their lives are following a set trajectory that move pretty fast through different phases of development in which those social lives are essential and sort of developmentally determinative. That, that those are costs that maybe are appropriate to bear, but those are quite profound costs. But the other side of this, there are many, many, many things one could add to the list. The relationships destroyed, the lives lost without saying final goodbyes, the transformation of religious communities and relationships. Somebody I know was in conversation with an archbishop early in March before there were shutdowns, and he was trying to decide what to do with his archdiocese, with masses in his archdiocese. He made the comment that there are some people in my archdiocese who would rather die than not attend mass every day. And what does one do about that? And how does one count those, in a sense, spiritual costs? But the other side of this is that numbers, we govern with numbers. And numbers are intrinsically political, in the sense that we choose to count some things and not to count others. And we choose to treat some things as though they count, and therefore count them, and not others. And that this is parsing what has happened, what is happening, and what has happened when we finally do recover and have that reckoning, will be very much a quantitative game. And I think it is imperative that we attend not just to what the numbers are, but what got counted and who counts, in the sense of having the authority to designate what numbers warrant collection, and who counts in the sense of having been given a kind of political and moral recognition by virtue of being counted versus not. I think that is essential. And that is, in a sense, a technocratic question that cannot have a technocratic answer. It needs the fullness of a kind of democratic attention to ensure that those production of numbers and the modes of learning and knock-on forms of governance that flow from them are right and legitimate in a democratic sense, not merely in terms of data collection.
Well, I regret that we have to deal with limits and humility in another way, which is we've come up against the hour, our scheduled time. I hope that our viewers, James Stoner and Rihanna Ramsey, recognize that the questions they sent in through Zoom were actually answered in the exchange between Ben Hurlbut and Farr Curlin. I have some closing remarks before a final note of thanks to our two expert guests. So thank you everyone for joining us. This is our second webinar of phase 2 of the Pandemic Dialogue series, the Reckoning and Recovery phase. Please check our website, scetl.asu.edu, for the upcoming webinar discussions about reckoning and recovery. We'll be looking at larger implications of the current pandemic, thinking about past recoveries from civic crises and what we might learn, and what all of this might mean for, not just for the present, but the future of the United States. One topic will be US relations with China coming up, and also a discussion of plans and principles about economic recovery. Much more information and the capacity to register for these upcoming Reckoning and Recovery webinars is on our website, scetl.asu.edu. If you enjoyed this webinar discussion, also please remember we have a podcast in the Pandemic Dialogue series. Look for that on our website, on iTunes, other podcast platforms. You can connect with that discussion via Twitter as well. I think it's hashtag Camus to contribute. There have been 6 episodes in that podcast discussion of Camus' novel, The Plague. They're posted again on our website, elsewhere in podcast land. We had earlier discussions in the Pandemic Dialogues series on Thucydides, Boccaccio, Edgar Allan Poe, and the zombie craze in current pop culture. I hope you'll look for those. And we'll have a recording of this webinar in a day or two up on our website. Thanks as always to our colleagues in the school who made this webinar and all the Pandemic Dialogue sessions possible. Dr. Carol McNamara, our Associate Director for Public Programs, Dr. Luke Perez, helping us with questions behind the scene, Joe Martin, our Communications Manager, and in this case, our Tech Guru, and Morgan Raddick from our events team. Thanks again very much to our guests, Farr Curlin of Duke University and Ben Hurlbut of Arizona State University, for a very rich conversation, which hopefully resonates with us as we continue to think about this civic crises and lessons we might draw for future crises. Thank you everyone for joining us. Be well, be hopeful, and good night.